You ever hit that breaking point where somebody pushes just a little too far and you snap? That's exactly what happened when my brand new neighbor decided to steal a farmer's tractor during planting season no less and then throw a party right on my family's land. This woman wasn't just a nuisance, she had already wrecked 3 other farm families before setting her sights on mine with her twisted legal maneuvers. She thought Iowa farmers were easy prey. She couldn't have been more wrong. What I did next turned into the most talked about act of payback in our county's history. Now picture it. Late April in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I had just a week left in my ideal planting window before May storms would flood the fields and leave my corn seed floating instead of growing. I was already behind from the wet spring, bills breathing down my neck, and no choice but to shave off sleep just to catch up. That's when she showed up at Clara Patterson. And let me tell you, this woman wasn't your run-of-the-mill difficult neighbor. She was calculated. I've farmed this land for 2 decades. Same as my father and grandfather before me. 3 generations of Prices have worked these 120 acres, and in all that time, we've had our share of complaints. A rooster crowing too early, a neighbor griping about the smell of manure, the kind of stuff you expect when city folks trade sidewalks for gravel roads. But Clara was in a league of her own. She rolled in with a measuring tape, a professional-grade camera, and what looked like a binder full of county codes. Who shows up to a neighborhood with homework? I first noticed her when I was out by the irrigation lines near the fence. There she was in spotless white sneakers, definitely not farm shoes, snapping detailed photos of my tractor, not quick little snapshots either. She was crouched down, recording serial numbers and measuring the exact distance from my equipment to the property line. I tried being friendly. "Morning, settling in okay?" I called out. She jumped like I'd caught her red-handed, stuffed a stack of papers into her designer bag, and gave me a smile that looked about as real as plastic. "Oh, just making content about rural living," she said, waving her phone like that was a normal explanation. The next day, Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood's unofficial information Huba, dropped off a casserole and a warning. She said Clara had been hanging around the coffee shop for hours, not sipping coffee like a normal customer but grilling locals about property values and who might be selling land. Even worse, she'd been asking pointed questions about me and my finances. By then, Clara's behavior was impossible to ignore. Every time I turned around, there she was with her phone, notebook, or measuring tools. She tracked when I started my tractor, how long I irrigated, and where I parked my equipment. It was like she was building a dossier, and I was the subject of her investigation. The real wake-up call came when I found her in my driveway at sunrise, photographing a little oil spot under my old pickup. When I asked what she thought she was doing, she coolly said she was documenting environmental hazards. That truck has dripped the same 3 drops of oil for 15 years. Things got more disturbing that evening. Walking back from the far end of the property, I spotted Clara in her car, light on, paperwork spread across the seats. She was on the phone throwing around phrases like abandoned vehicle regulations and commercial zoning violations. Through her window I could see charts, maps, and photographs of my equipment arranged like evidence on a detective's wall. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just documenting complaints, she was plotting. She had turned her rental house into a war room, complete with county codes and highlighted notes. My suspicion was confirmed when a gust of wind blew one of her papers right into my driveway. It was a copy of a county ordinance about removing commercial vehicles from residential areas. She had highlighted the part that applied to tractors and written a note in neat handwriting: "Target a large tractor parked overnight." My blood ran cold. She wasn't planning to argue with me. She was planning to tow the most vital piece of equipment I owned during the busiest week of the farming year. And no, moving the tractor every night wasn't an option. That machine was the heart of my operation. Without it, I couldn't get the corn in the ground in time. Plus, it wasn't just a tractor, it was a symbol of 3 generations fighting to keep this land alive. Looking at Clara's notes, it was clear she wasn't after compromise. She wanted to win. And from the way she organized everything, illegal jargon, timelines, and procedures, it looked like she'd done this before. That night, I called my cousin Jimmy, who'd gone through something similar in another county. His words still echo in my head: If someone moves to farm country with that much legal prep, they're either working for developers trying to push people off their land, or they're running an insurance scam. Either way, you're not dealing with a nosy Navarro, you're dealing with a professional. Jimmy's dairy farm had barely survived, but only after burning through 30 grand in legal fees and nearly losing everything. As I sat on the porch holding those county papers Clara dropped, I realized tomorrow was marked as her big move. 4 days of reconnaissance had led to this. And if her notes were right, tomorrow was execution day. While I was out in the north field checking drainage, Clara was busy marching into the Cedar County office with a folder thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. I've dealt with more than my share of red tape over the years: permits, inspections, livestock roulette, and I know thorough paperwork when I see it. Hers looked like it belonged in a courtroom, not a county office. She had everything. Photographs stamped with dates and times, exact measurements, highlighted ordinances, and citations so polished they could have come straight out of a law textbook. Later, the clerk admitted it was the most airtight complaint she'd seen in over a decade. By mid-morning, I found a bright orange notice zip-tied to my tractor's steering wheel. Violation: abandoned commercial vehicle in a residential zone. 48-hour removal notice. Reading it felt like being hit in the gut with a concrete block. Abandoned? That tractor had been running daily. Commercial vehicle? It was farm equipment, sitting on farmland. But the county seal was there in black and white, giving Claire the leverage she needed to turn a petty feud into official action. I called the county office, furious. Their response: "Sir, we've received a complete complaint with full documentation. You have 48 hours to move the vehicle or it will be subject to authorized removal." Authorized removal. They were talking about my father's tractor like it was some junker left on the side of the highway. I was scrambling to figure out how to fight the notice and still keep planting when Clara struck again. Around 2 in the afternoon, while I was checking the far end of my land, she moved in. She must have been watching me, because the moment I was out of sight, up rolled Bob Smith with his tow truck. Not our deputy sheriff Boba, this was the one from Peterson's auto recovery. Bob looked miserable, clutching the county paperwork like it was a bulletproof vest. "Sorry, Gavin," he muttered, not even meeting my eyes as I ran back across the field. "County order." She paid the service fee and slipped in an extra $300 cash for quick pickup. "Says it's abandoned equipment." Bob had been towing in this county for years, and he knew my tractor wasn't abandoned. But he also knew the difference between following orders and losing his job. So up went my tractor, chained down on the flatbed, while I stood there helpless. Clara was practically directing the scene like a Hollywood director, ordering Bob to take photos from every angle, making sure that bright orange county notice was visible in each shot. And of course, she was live streaming the entire thing to her online followers, spinning it as some kind of heroic act of neighborhood safety. The financial blow landed instantly. $500 just to release my tractor from impound, with storage fees ticking up by the hour. But worse than the money was the time I lost to 2 precious days of planting season, gone forever while I battled bureaucracy. In farming, timing isn't just money, it's survival. Miss your window and you might as well burn your mortgage payment in a barrel. I borrowed my neighbor Jim's old tractor to keep working, but it was slow, clunky, and barely able to keep up, like running a marathon in shoes 3 sizes too small. Possible, but painful. And Clara wasn't done basking in her victory. That evening, dragging myself back from the impound lot, I nearly choked when I saw her car parked half on my property. Not just any car either, a gleaming white Rolls Royce, because apparently playing landlord had been lucrative. There she was, smiling for selfies with my fields behind her. "Live streaming again, property secured," she declared to her audience, waving toward my land like she just planted a flag for the Queen. The audacity of it. She had cost me hundreds of dollars, 2 days of planting, and untold stress, and now she was standing on my land, bragging about her so-called victory. But in her arrogance, she made a mistake. She didn't realize she was 8 feet past the property line. See, my father had the land surveyed decades ago. The boundaries were marked with stone every 100 feet, and metal posts at the corners. A map of it all sat on file at the county office. Clara might have studied ordinances and towing laws, But she hadn't done her homework on the most important part, where my land ended and hers began. Watching her pose with my soil as her backdrop, something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, it was the clarity that comes when a puzzle finally clicks into place. Clara hadn't come here for rural peace, she came with a mission, and step one of that mission had gone off like clockwork. But step two, operating on my property, was going to be her undoing. Out here, we've got our own rules. One of them is simple: you don't park on another man's land unless you're prepared to become part of it. That night, I sat on the porch with a cold beer, my father's old survey map stretched across my knees, staring at her rolls gleaming like a trophy 8 feet into my yard. Mrs. Henderson stopped by with sweet tea and a worried look I hadn't seen since she was scolding troublemakers back at the elementary school. "Gavin," she said, easing into the chair beside me, "that woman's not finished." Betty heard her at the coffee shop making calls about insurance claims and hostile neighbor disputes. Today was just the beginning. Insurance claims, hostile neighbor disputes. Suddenly, the tractor tow felt like a warm-up act. Before locking up for the night, I glanced one more time at Clara's luxury car sitting there, perfectly staged for her next morning's stream about community standards. She'd researched every ordinance in the book about how to remove my equipment, but she'd overlooked the one unspoken law of farm country: if you're going to celebrate on someone else's land, you better have been invited. Clara thought she was playing chess with her legal loopholes and bonuses, but she'd made a fatal miscalculation. She brought city regulations to a farm fight, and out here, we have our own brand of justice. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I found myself standing in the shed, staring at my father's old backup tractor, wrestling with the kind of decision farmers don't take lightly. Normally, patience pays better than impulse. But after watching Clara dance on my family's land, I wasn't so sure patience was the right play anymore. When somebody steals your livelihood, patience stops feeling like a virtue. Clara had spent weeks digging through laws and loopholes to figure out how to strip me of my tractor. It was time she got a crash course in how property disputes are handled where rows of corn are straighter than county roads. Her mistake: she'd memorized county codes and towing rules but skipped the most important chapter: agricultural rights. Out here, preparing soil, cutting drainage, and irrigating are about as legally protected as breathing. And since she'd parked her $400,000 Rolls-Royce square inches the middle of where I needed to run channels for spring rain so well, that was her poor judgment, not mine. So just before midnight, I fired up my father's old backup tractor. There's a particular satisfaction in the growl of a diesel engine when you're about to demonstrate the unwritten laws of farm country. My plan was simple, clean, and completely within my rights: prepare the soil around her illegally parked car. If that meant her fancy tires sank into Iowa clay, so be it. She should have thought about drainage before staging a victory parade on my land. The cultivator sliced the ground in tidy furrows, 18 inches deep, perfect for channeling water, shallow enough to avoid damaging the rolls, but deep enough that, by morning dew, her city tires would be locked in tighter than a hog in a chute. Iowa clay doesn't let go once it's wet. By dawn, the picture was complete: a gleaming luxury car sitting smack in the middle of perfectly turned earth, like some kind of modern art piece. Agriculture meets engineering, you might call it. And I had every detail documented of photos, videos, survey markers, timestamps. If Clara wanted a paperwork war, I was more than ready to show her what 20 years of dealing with inspectors had taught me. The difference was simple: my records showed lawful farm work on my own property, hers showed trespass and false reporting. The sunrise painted everything gold, mist rising off the furrows like stage smoke. Clara strutted out of her rental house in silk pajamas, a $300 a set. I later heard her expecting to hop into her car and start another round of harassment. Instead, she found her pride and joy stuck fast in my field. The sound she made wasn't a scream, wasn't a cry, it was something new, the unholy child of both. She waved her arms, shrieking into her phone: "My $400,000 Rolls-Royce has been a broken bar, agriculturally attacked." I nearly spilled my coffee laughing. The dispatcher on the other end must have thought she was having a nervous breakdown. "Ma'am, did you say your car was a broken bar attacked?" Clara doubled down. It's planted like corn. This is rural terrorism. Watching her pace around in silk pajamas, fuzzy slippers sinking into mud, while trying to describe her victimization was better than any comedy show on TV. Every photo she took only proved my point. A luxury car illegally parked on farmland, surrounded by illegitimate soil prep. It looked less like vandalism and more like an art exhibit titled Consequences. Deputy Harris rolled up mid-morning, and I've got to hand it to him, he kept a straight face, though I could see the corner of his mouth twitching. He checked the survey markers, reviewed Clara's frantic complaint, and compared it all with the county notice that had once been slapped on my tractor. Finally, he turned to me. "Gavin, you want to explain this?" "Simple," I said. "She parked on my land. I tilled my soil. If she hadn't been trespassing or hadn't taken my tractor yesterday, maybe I'd have gone around. But this is standard farm work." Harris pulled out his GPS unit. Sure enough, the rolls was a full 8 feet over the line. Trespassing, obstructing farm operations, and not a shred of legal ground to stand on. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Clara as she sputtered about agricultural terrorism, "your vehicle is illegally parked. Mr. Price is within his rights to prepare his land." By lunchtime, the story was spreading faster than church gossip. Neighbors showed up with coffee and donuts just to witness the spectacle. Folks were already calling the great car planting. Mrs. Henderson came armed with sweet tea and her phone camera, positioning herself like she was covering a breaking news event. There stood Clara, mud-streaked silk pajamas clinging to her legs, still demanding I be arrested for farming my own soil. Meanwhile, the rest of us treated it like a county fair sideshow. Folks congratulated me for giving her a taste of her own medicine, and Clara slowly realized her master plan had blown up in her face. She'd studied how to remove my tractor, but she'd never studied what happens when you trespass onto farm ground. By the end of the day, she was the one calling tow companies, arguing with insurance agents, and digging herself into legal quicksand, while I was back in my tractor getting seed in the ground. Sometimes justice really does sprout straight from the soil. And that's when things went from local entertainment to statewide spectacle. By mid-afternoon, Channel 6 News out of Cedar Rapids sent a reporter and a cameraman to cover what they dubbed the $400,000 car crop story. Watching that group try to navigate farm country was almost as good as watching Clara melt down. The reporter, Jessica Thompson, was dressed like she was headed to a city gala, heels sinking 3 inches into the mud with every step, while her cameraman kept glaring at the dirt like it was trying to assassinate his expensive equipment. They quickly realized they'd stumbled onto the kind of quirky human interest piece that spreads like wildfire. There was Clara, now fully convinced that media attention would save her, ranting about weaponized agriculture and toxic rural masculinity targeting successful women. I stood there listening, shaking my head, thinking to myself, only in Iowa could regular soil prep be accused of being a military operation. Lady, if you think tilling soil counts as warfare, you've clearly never spent a day on an actual farm. When Jessica aimed her microphone my way, I kept it plain and steady, the way my father always said to handle lawyers, reporters, or anyone looking to twist your words. "Ma'am, she parked on my property, illegally, after spending 2 weeks scheming how to get my tractor hauled off during planting season. I did what farmers do, I worked my ground. If she'd minded her boundaries, her car would still be shining in her own driveway instead of learning firsthand how unforgiving Iowa clay can be." The beauty of telling the truth is that it doesn't need theatrics or long explanations. It just sits there, solid, for anyone with common sense to recognize. But Jessica wasn't just any reporter, she had a knack for digging. Instead of painting this as a simple neighbor spat, she started connecting the dots. She sat with Mrs. Henderson, who eagerly shared what she'd witnessed during Clara's reconnaissance weeks. "Honey," Mrs. Henderson said to the camera, sipping sweet tea on my porch, "that girl measured this man's land like she was planning a highway project. Normal folks don't unpack surveying gear just to introduce themselves." Then Betty from the coffee shop chimed in, telling Jessica how Clara had been prying into everyone's finances and land values like she was compiling some report. Suddenly the gossip looked more like evidence. Even Bob Smith, the tow truck driver who'd helped with my tractor, came forward. He admitted he'd felt guilty and decided to clear the air. She knew the paperwork better than I did, he confessed on camera. Had the fees in cash, had the complaint ready, filmed the whole thing. 15 years towing cars, and I've never seen somebody coordinate like that unless they were law enforcement or insurance fraud investigators. By sundown, Jessica had enough material for a 3-part investigative piece, and then Clara did the dumbest thing she could have done. She doubled down online, despite everyone telling her to shut up. She plastered social media with rants, selfies, and live streams, screaming about agricultural extremists. What she didn't realize was that every post was time-stamped proof of her planning, her paperwork, and her too polished grasp of legal maneuvers. Mrs. Henderson, bless her sharp eye, had been screenshotting everything from the beginning. Once Jessica got her hands on that archive, the picture sharpened. Clara's feed was a roadmap, posts about troublesome farmers, celebrations about winning boundary disputes, advice threads in rural land speculation groups, the smoking gun, a live stream where she was coaching someone off camera on insurance tactics while county regulations lay spread across her dashboard. Jessica's digging turned up something chilling. Clara had lived in 3 other small towns over 4 years: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and in each, she'd waged nearly identical campaigns against neighboring farmers. Deputy Harris showed up that evening, carrying a folder heavy with reports and a look on his face that could curdle milk. "Gavin," he said, lowering himself into my dad's old porch chair, "this woman isn't just a bad neighbor. She's part of a machine." Inside that folder were police reports from Willow Creek, Minnesota, where Clara had filed 47 noise complaints and 3 lawsuits against an elderly dairyman named Frank Miller until he sold his farm, land that had been in his family 3 generations. Prairie View, Wisconsin, same script. A young couple bankrupt after battling her nuisance suits. Their organic vegetable farm sold off for pennies. Every case followed the same pattern: exaggerated complaints, airtight paperwork, legal harassment, then land snapped up by the Midwest Rural Development Corporation. Harris flipped through the documents of financial records, insurance payouts, consulting fees. Clara had collected more than 80 grand working hand in glove with that development outfit, plus side money from settlements she forced out of family farmers. "You didn't just stick it to a nosy neighbor with that tractor stunt," Harris said grimly. "You may have tripped up a criminal operation that's been bleeding rural families dry across the Midwest." The weight of it settled on me like a sack of seed corn. Clara hadn't just moved here on a whim. She'd targeted my farm. The surveys, the measurements, the midnight calls. It was all part of a refined playbook. Step 1. Weaken the farmer with legal headaches. Step 2. Force a choice between bankruptcy or selling out cheap. Step 3. Hand the land to developers. Other folks had lost their homes, their savings, their legacies. My grandfather had cleared this ground by hand in the 40s, and now I was staring at files showing just how close I'd come to losing it all myself. Her one mistake: bringing her scheme to a community that still looked after its own, and to a farmer who'd grown up watching his family fight to keep what was theirs. That night, staring at those files spread across my kitchen table, I wondered if burying her car in mud was really enough to stop someone this practiced. And the next morning brought an answer I hadn't expected. FBI agent Rebecca Stone in my kitchen at 7 a.m., badge flashing, briefcase on the table, and news that made my coffee taste like battery acid. The moment Agent Stone stepped into my kitchen, I realized my neighbor feud had turned into something far bigger than Cedar Falls. Her words were precise, professional, and terrifying. Interstate conspiracy, mail fraud, systematic scheme to defraud agricultural property owners. I sat there in my work clothes, smelling faintly of diesel and fertilizer, while a woman in a pressed suit laid out how my petty act of tractor vengeance had tripped a federal alarm. What I thought was a personal feud had actually exposed a network the FBI had been circling for years without quite pinning down. Stone spread photos across my table like a dealer running the worst hand of poker anyone's ever seen. There was Frank Miller, a weathered Minnesotan, standing broken beside the for sale sign on land his family had milked cows on since the 1920s. Then Janet Torres of Wisconsin, a widow forced to sell her grain farm when insurance companies blacklisted her after Clara's harassment. Next, Brad and Lisa Cooper from Illinois, Two idealistic college kids who had dreamed of organic farming, but instead were driven into bankruptcy court after Claire bled them dry with nuisance suits. "Mr. Price," Stone said softly, her voice steady in that way only seasoned law enforcement officers manage when they're delivering devastation, "you're looking at three families who lost everything to the same woman who was setting her sights on you." The records she laid out were as chilling as they were meticulous: profit spreadsheets, target profiles, even projections on how long each project would take before a forced sale. Claire's operation wasn't random, it was a business model. Each farm she targeted generated her somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 in direct payouts from Midwest rural development, plus another $8,000 to $15,000 skimmed off insurance settlements and harassment claims. Over 4 years, she'd pocketed nearly $200,000 by dismantling families, bankrupting communities, and flipping farmland into shopping plazas and subdivisions. But the money wasn't the worst of it. She preyed on vulnerability. Frank, a 70-year-old widower with no family to back him up; Janet, drowning in medical bills; the Coopers, too new and too naive to Macron V to recognize the trap before it closed; and me, single, no kids, strapped with equipment loans, and without family nearby to help weather a legal storm. Claire had read my life like an open file. She hadn't moved to Cedar Falls for the view. She'd moved because my farm fit her blueprint. Agent Stone showed me the scaffolding behind it all. Midwest Rural Development wasn't some passive buyer, they were complicit. They gave Claire legal coaching, connected her to attorneys skilled in agricultural nuisance law, and fast-tracked her insurance claims. They even had real estate specialists standing by to rezone farmland the moment a deed changed hands. This wasn't a lone con artist. This was organized crime in business casual, and I'd almost been the fourth casualty. Stone laid out the sequence Claire had planned for me like it was a script she'd performed before. Step 1. Drag me into insurance disputes with fabricated damage claims. Step 2. Bury me in nuisance lawsuits to bleed me dry. Step 3. Flood social media with portrayals of me as some unstable rural extremist, to isolate me from the community. Step 4. A settlement offer that seemed merciful compared to legal costs, coincidentally paired with a bargain bin purchase offer from Midwest Rural Development. I'd nearly walked that path without realizing it. By late April, the feds had frozen Claire's accounts and tapped her calls. What they caught was darker than anyone expected. She wasn't working alone. She was plugged into a network of Womena rural lifestyle consultants. Stone called them with bureaucratic dryness, running parallel operations in towns across the Midwest. 6 active jobs, maybe more. Dairies, seed growers, family farms, each one being hollowed out, just like mine almost had been. Then came the moment that drove it all home. Stone introduced me, via video call, to Claire's earlier victims. Frank Miller sat in a cramped trailer, voice heavy with resignation. "She knew more about dairy regs than my vet," he said. By the time I realized it was a setup, I'd burned $15,000 in legal FESA and she was just warming up. Janet Torres, pixelated but unflinching, described how Claire had masqueraded as a friend, recommending helpful lawyers who were, in fact, working for the development company. Every piece of advice, every suggestion, carefully crafted to sink her deeper. The Coopers told how they'd been tricked into signing a settlement that barred them from farming their own land. The property was still technically theirs, but their dream was dead. Each story revealed a woman who was less con artist than tactician, as someone who studied regulations, profiled her targets, and pressed precisely where she knew they'd break. It was less fraud than psychological warfare, applied with surgical precision. And she'd had backup plans. Internal company emails revealed protocols for when farmers resist media smear campaigns, social pressure strategies, even orchestrated property damage claims. My case had already triggered several of those measures, the ones Midwest Rural Development referred to as the Iowa situation. The kicker? Claire's files listed 17 more families lined up as her next victims, complete with detailed profiles and financial analyses. Farmers in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, all marked for erasure. The FBI had pulled in agricultural fraud experts, insurance investigators, and even something I didn't know existed, the Rural Crimes Task Force. Suddenly this wasn't just about my muddy revenge stunt, it was about whether systematic attacks on America's farms could be considered domestic terrorism. On April 25th, I stood in my own kitchen staring at walls plastered with evidence boards, photographs, and flowcharts. It looked like a crime drama set. But the stakes were real. Clara's scheme was crumbling, toppled not by some grand investigation, but by her own arrogance in assuming farmers are simple folk who fold under pressure. By the next day, April 26th, I was no longer just a farmer. I was the government's star witness in what the press was already calling the largest agricultural fraud case in Iowa history. And Clara Patterson, once the smug neighbor with a clipboard, now sat at a federal defense table in Cedar Rapids, finally stripped of the illusion that she was untouchable. The jury was taken through Clara's 4-year string of crimes, showing how her endless disputes with neighbors had brought her nearly $200,000 in illicit earnings while driving 4 farm families into financial collapse. Evidence laid out before the court included banking records, emails, phone recordings, and social media posts, all revealing her calculated malice, carefully disguised as suburban victim advocacy. Her lawyer, a polished woman from Des Moines who looked out of place in a rural courtroom, tried painting Clara as nothing more than a misunderstood city professional, overwhelmed by the challenges of country living. My client is the victim of cultural confusion, attorney Jennifer Walsh declared in her opening remarks. She moved to the farming community seeking peace, and when conflicts arose with hostile neighbors, she turned to the legal system to address genuine safety concerns. Judge Wilson's unimpressed expression suggested she had heard more convincing arguments from speeding ticket defendants. The prosecution's case, in contrast, was thorough, clear, and devastating. Prosecutor Rodriguez played phone recordings of Clara coordinating with Midwest Rural Development on which families to target and how to handle resistance. The jury was shown her meticulous victim file essay complete with financial stress reports and psychological profiles meant to exploit farmers' weakest points. Perhaps the most incriminating evidence was Clara's own social media content, where she celebrated destroying farm families and even trained other consultants on how to harass without getting caught. When my turn to testify arrived, I kept my words straight and simple, just as my father had always taught me when serious matters were at stake. I explained Clara's surveillance of my farm, her bogus documentation of violations, and her work with county officials to have my equipment seized at the height of planting season. When Judge Wilson asked how her actions had affected me, I told her plainly, she wasn't trying to take my tractor, she was trying to take my family's farming legacy and turn it into a strip mall. That's not a dispute between neighbors. That's an attack on everything rural America stands for. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Frank Miller, who had lost his dairy farm after 45 years of hard work. A 70-year-old widower who had weathered recessions, bad crops, and personal tragedy. Frank broke down as he described watching his cattle sold at auction, unable to withstand Clara's relentless campaign. She knew exactly what she was doing, he told the jury, voice trembling. She studied my farm closer than the bank ever did when I applied for a loan. She knew what claims would drag me through regulations, what insurance battles I couldn't win, and how far she could push until I gave up. Expert witnesses strengthened the prosecution's case further. Dr. Betty Wilson, a rural sociology professor from Iowa State, explained how Clara exploited vulnerabilities common to family farms as social isolation, financial strain, and generational transitions. Her victims weren't chosen at random, she testified. They were carefully researched and targeted using deep knowledge of rural community structures. Economist Dr. Robert Walker then calculated that Clara's scheme had stripped more than 8,000 acres from family farming, costing over $12 million in lost production. This wasn't just fraud, Walker explained. It was a deliberate dismantling of rural economies to replace farmland with commercial development. The defense unraveled completely when Judge Wilson allowed evidence from Clara's own devices, which her attorneys had fought to exclude. Texts showed her mocking victims as farm marks and agricultural targets. Emails revealed she earned performance bonuses for how fast she could pressure families into selling. Worst of all were recordings of Clara coaching others on how to intensify psychological pressure during planting and harvest seasons. By the time sentencing arrived, Farming families from across the Midwest filled the courtroom. Judge Wilson made it clear she understood the larger weight of the case. These defendants didn't just break the law, she said. They struck at the very backbone of American agriculture, family farms that preserve both economic strength and cultural heritage. Clara received 12 years in federal prison, was ordered to repay over $300,000, and was banned for life from living within 50 miles of farmland. Meanwhile, Midwest Rural Development's assets were seized, its corporate structure dissolved, and its executives charged. Their agricultural holdings were placed in a federal trust to be restored to family farms rather than commercial developers. The most powerful moment came when Judge Wilson addressed Clara directly. You and your partners treated farming families as obstacles and their land as prey. You studied rural life not to respect it, but to exploit its weaknesses. This court hopes your punishment warns anyone else who might consider attacking America's agricultural roots. 1 year later, I still stand amazed at how much has changed. The very spot where Clara's Rolls-Royce sank into Iowa soil now grows the tallest, healthiest corn in the field thanks to the soil treatments needed to clean up her car's fluids. People drive from Cedar Rapids and Iowa City just to see the infamous planted car patch. The settlement money allowed me to pay off debts early and invest in new technology that boosted yields. Media coverage brought partnerships with agricultural schools and rural advocates, giving farmers the tools to recognize and resist similar schemes. I've spoken before Congress, worked with the FBI's rural crime units, and somehow found myself regarded as an expert on agricultural crime prevention. Frank Miller used his settlement to buy a small hobby farm in Minnesota, mentoring young farmers. Janet Torres expanded her grain business into organics with national support. The Cooper family restarted their farm with federal loans and now fight for policies to protect new farmers. Clara's entire network collapsed. 17 more consultants face charges. Dozens of similar companies are under investigation, and the FBI's Rural Crimes Task Force has become a permanent federal program. Congress even passed new laws to protect family farms from predatory harassment. Mrs. Henderson, now 86, has become something of a legend, featured in magazines, speaking at conferences, and advising researchers on rural resilience. Just last week, as we watched the sunset from my porch, she told me, "Your daddy would be proud you turned that woman's cruelty into something that protects families everywhere." Cedar Falls itself has transformed into a model of rural renewal. Property values rose, local businesses thrive, and new farm families move in knowing this is a community that protects its own. Looking across my fields tonight, I realize Clara thought she'd found an easy victim, an isolated farmer without resources, but she miscalculated the most important part of rural life: neighbors who stand together when their way of life is threatened. Sometimes justice does grow straight from the soil. Sometimes stopping one predator saves dozens of families from losing everything. And as for that patch of corn where her luxury car took root, it's still the most fertile land on my farm, a reminder that even the worst battles can produce something good if you fight with patience, strength, and community by your side.